And if I need more volume on this microphone for this, so be it. Ladies and gentlemen, here we are for the last session of the evening. My name's Ben Zachariah. I work for the Einstein Forum. And the floor is to be yielded in half a minute to Peter Kramer. Peter Kramer. Yeah. Peter.
Should we wait a little longer? I don't know. We seem to have lost our
I think a couple of people said they had to leave.
audience.
Okay. One person needed what's now called a bio break.
Well, I'm going to riff for a minute or two, and I will probably largely read what I've written the way James Wood did in the morning. But I want to say how this is my third time speaking at the forum. How wonderful an opportunity I consider it, how grateful I am to be here. This is Susan Nyman's last forum, and I think we should... Next to last. How grateful we are to her for having sustained this, having created this community. It seems to me one of the extraordinary opportunities in life, and in particular for, partly because there are such people who are so expert in all these different fields who assemble here, but partly because we are asked largely to speak about topics that are not native to our own work. And when Susan wrote me and said that we would be speaking about judgment, I thought, well, I had written about judgment. My last nonfiction book, Ordinarily Well, is about what I consider to be a canard, the idea that antidepressants don't really work. And it's a book about how we judge research, how we read research, and also about the question of whether clinical work has some value, clinical judgment, whether what doctors believe has any say in this world in which research plays such a decisive role in what narrowly based research in what doctors do. I'm thinking back to another era when my book Listening to Prozac was popular. I was asked to speak a great deal. And in particular, as well as speaking to the general public, I spoke to academic audiences. And this was 1993 to 1994. Bill Clinton had been running for president. And it was a moment when politicians would speak in churches and they would say, as Clinton sort of had to say, "I come before you as a sinner." And so I would start my talk with academics and say, "I come before you as a clinician." And because I understood that there was sort of some resentment from my being at the podium at all. And I have stopped seeing patients. I stopped seeing patients a few years ago. So I'm coming before you as sort of a reformed or retired clinician, but a clinician still in my perspective. And I thought instead of speaking about research, I would speak about what the clinical perspective is. And I'm going to start with something that is not really the main part of the talk, but it seems to me that that no one has really captured what it is like to be an outpatient psychiatrist sitting with a patient. When I went to medical school, I'd been a patient in psychoanalysis, and I thought people would teach me how it was done. That now I was sort of on the other side of the Oedipal divide, and I would learn what it was like to be in this position. And no one who knew psychoanalysis wanted to teach in that way. It remained a sort of a mystical enterprise. And I instead apprenticed myself to Leston Havens, who's an existential psychotherapist. And he was very interested in modes of expression. He wrote, among other things, about how we speak, what it is we say when we're with patients. So I'm going to do a little riff on that and then get into a different kind of judgment entirely. Imagine that your patient makes a bitter complaint about a lover and contemplates a hostile response. You recall that the patient spoke this way in the past before making an impulsive choice. Should you address the tone or the content of the patient's remarks? Is the proper focus the patient's anger or despair? Perhaps the patient is expressing contempt toward you. It may seem right to ask a question to gather information. Right or overly provocative? What is the apt manner of expression? Exclamation, question, or declarative statement? It may be best to advance a hypothesis and invite the patient to correct you. What is your intent? Support, interpretation, or confrontation? You may be reassessing the patient's condition in light of the force of today's complaint. Perhaps you'll comment on what appears to be a symptom. Pressive speech. The patient is speaking too rapidly. A medication adjustment may be called for. Meanwhile, you're monitoring your own internal state, hostility or warmth and protectiveness. Why, in the face of the apparent urgency, are you bored? This self-monitoring must happen quickly. If you're to speak, you'll want to do so in rhythm, on beat. Or faster yet, if you need to mimic Harry Stack Sullivan, who in response to a patient's disastrous plan cried out, "Merciful God, let's consider what will happen if you do that." More generally, you consider modes of expression. Some statements are made in the patient's voice as from within the patient's mind. "He still hates me," rather than from the therapist. "You're afraid he still hates you." Perhaps a brief exclamation, "Hatred," will cover most ground. It can seem that each moment in the therapy requires judgment of a certain sort. Call it procedural judgment on many axes. To reference judgment ignores the role of instinct, intuition, and presence in the moment. Perhaps something just pops out of your mouth. Leston Havens, a Harvard-based psychiatrist, the mentor I mentioned, once said that when a therapist feels that he just must say something, he should withhold it, because therapy should arise from freedom, not compulsion. The paradox built into that advice covers a whole realm of judgment regarding the balance between control and spontaneity of expression, between dedication to the task and narcissism. I hope that in this account you hear an echo of Zeno's paradox. As a psychiatrist, if you take responsibility seriously as you must, you can never take a single step, never get from here to there. Equally, you must act. The enterprise seems to demand constant judgment. But it's also true that judgment of a different sort, call it substantive judgment, this is the actual talk, has a bad name in psychotherapy. We do not want for the therapist's views to be imposed on the patient, at least often we don't. You may be aware of a cautionary tale. In 1921, in the course of a psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud determined that a promising American psychiatrist, Horace Frink, suffered from latent homosexuality. Freud considered latent homosexuality a dangerous condition, poorly responsive to treatment. It was Freud's opinion that only a divorce from Frink's dull wife, Doris, followed by a new marriage to Frink's mistress and former patient, Angelica Bejour, would hold Horace Frink on the healthy side of the sexual divide. Do people know this story? No. Freud had Angelica travel to Vienna and advised her directly, saying that if she threw over Dr. Frink, he would never return to normality. Horace, who had 2 children with Doris, became depressed and psychotic over the prospect of his divorce. Each couple split. Frink and Bejour married, and Frink descended into psychosis, becoming openly hostile to his new wife. Frink then came under the care of Adolf Meyer at the Phipps Clinic at Johns Hopkins, who called Freud's behavior nauseating. Frink never fully recovered. The story has other disturbing aspects. I wrote a brief Freud biography, and I tell this story more fully there. When Sander Ferenczi could not decide between 2 romantic interests, Freud took it on himself to propose to one of them on Ferenczi's behalf. These cases may sound idiosyncratic, but it's possible to discern a leaning toward judgment and advice even in Freud's early exploratory work. Consider the case of Miss Lucy R., whom Freud treated in the 1880s, so among his earliest patients. She's a 30-year-old governess subject to depression and distinctive symptoms, the perception of odors like the smell of burnt pudding and cigar smoke. Ultimately, Freud cures Miss Lucy by confronting her. I believe that you are really in love with your employer, the director, though perhaps without being aware of it yourself, and that you have a secret hope of taking his late wife's place in actual fact. Along the way, Freud traces the olfactory hallucinations to their unconscious and historical roots, but he does not really need to. The danger of romance between governesses and employers was a Victorian commonplace. It dominates certain Sherlock Holmes tales. Jane Eyre's plot depends on it. Household manuals discussed ways to avert this complication. Never mind burnt pudding. To crack the case, all you need is awareness of typical impulses of poor governesses. Freud's confrontation of Lucy had the force of a decided recommendation, one that she then followed. Although in his theoretical writings, his recommendations were in the opposite direction, Freud was often a pragmatist, reliant on social judgment. So we can talk more about this in the discussion period, sort of what Freud says about judgment versus what he does about judgment. But after Freud's death, his profession's rules became more explicit through the adoption of principles like neutrality. The therapist refrains from taking sides in patients' internal conflicts and from imposing values from the outside. Adam Phillips's work is on these lines, many people's are, built around warnings that psychoanalysts must not become gurus or experts on how people should live. And this is Phillips. The psychoanalyst is a professional who sustains his competence by resisting his own authority. The professions also turned against fundamental Freudian concepts. I've mentioned latent homosexuality. Penis envy and castration anxiety are examples as well. Even the central task of psychoanalysis, mitigating Oedipal conflicts, came to be seen as problematic. Freud took these constructs to be scientific discoveries. Critics understand them as cultural observation. Freud's patients grew up in a society in which men felt competitive towards strict fathers and women had reason to envy men. The society channeled sexual desires in ways that the avant-garde considered constrained, and so on. The complexes encapsulate awareness of how social interactions are likely to play out. They are static versions of judgment. The reaction to these aspects of Freudianism led to a series of alternative psychotherapies, and among those still sympathetic to psychoanalysis, efforts to save the discipline from Freud. Two of the schools that were influential in my own training and practice were self-psychology and existential psychotherapy. Self-psychology emphasizes empathy as a tool. Existential psychotherapy emphasizes openness and immediacy. I distinguish them this way. In the empathic posture, the doctor sits across from the patient and tries to feel what the patient feels. In the existential posture, the doctor sits beside the patient and tries to look out at the world as the patient does, metaphorically. Imagine a patient who reports being under attack from hostile forces. Using empathy, the therapist might say, "How vulnerable you feel." The existential therapist might say, "The bastards." The important point for us is that in neither case is the therapist to exercise judgment, that is, to see past what may be a delusion to the contretemps as it might have looked to a neutral observer. Surely the therapist will not offer any response that suggests that the patient is misinterpreting the behavior and attitudes of the supposed enemies. In the early 1990s, I spoke with self-psychologists about their clinical posture. Anna Ornstein, a major therapist, said that the key is listening from within the patient's perspective and without judging his behavior in terms of how it deviates from what the therapist considers normal and healthy. Richard Geist said that self-psychologists distinguish themselves by not relying on their own ordinary social sense. Existential therapy probably is not as strict on this, but still it would be unusual to sit outside the patient and judge things based on social norms. These methods are powerful. When patients who have been dismissed or ridiculed find their perceptions and feelings reflected or echoed with precision, they respond with relief and additional effort. They may reveal other aspects of their awareness, saying, well, they're not all that bad, or sometimes I wonder whether I'm not mistaken. Powerful for the doctor, too. You learn to respect what at first seem strange inclinations. The attunement strategy helps prevent the therapist from enforcing conventions on the patient. It may avoid that grievous flaw, acting like one of the patient's parents. But the attunement strategy requires great patience, and failure to rely on other resources like conventional judgment entails risk. As a patient in psychoanalysis, I especially valued sessions when I entered a trance and spoke from deep within myself, and all the more if I found that my therapist had entered the trance as well and seemed equally to speak from within me. But I also have a special place in my heart for instances when the analyst employed his social judgment. I recall complaining that I could not sustain long hours of studying. I was studying physics to become a doctor. I would interrupt myself and read a chapter of a murder mystery to decompress before returning to the work. Rather than join me in examining my self-undermining tendencies, my analyst said, "That's how you do study." I can't decide whether that dismissal from 50 years ago introduced an element of common sense or ruined my habits for life. But it gave me permission to attempt similar interventions with my own patients, signaling when seemingly neurotic behavior was worrisome and when it was expectable or even productive. As a therapist, I worked at sitting beside the patient and looking outward, but I was pragmatic by nature. If I didn't speak my mind, often patients could read it and conclude that I had a decided opinion about the course of action that they were proposing. My limitations were part of the motivation for my book about intimacy, Should You Leave? In it, I cataloged instances like Freud's with Bajor and Ferenczi, when psychiatrists who opposed the use of advice employed it nonetheless. Some such instances are forced on the field. Psychiatry is a profession embedded within a society and licensed by it. Say that a patient has thoughts of doing harm to a neighbor. The doctor will gauge the seriousness of the intent, ask questions to refine the assessment, and when necessary, report the problem to authorities. Empathy may assist in the gathering of information, but the doctor's judgment, separate from the patient's, is the relevant one. There's a critique of liberalism that warns that political systems that claim to be grounded in principles of the Enlightenment, like tolerance and mutual respect, fail in times of crisis. Then the government assumes autocratic powers in arbitrary fashion. It may be that self-psychology and existential psychiatry share a parallel flaw. They can collapse into confrontations grounded entirely in the therapist's judgment, a shift likely to be received by patients as a betrayal. Worse yet, because of external requirements like the duty to warn, even devoted adherents of attunement will need regularly throughout the entire course of treatment to oscillate to an external perspective. Alongside legal considerations, there are medical ones like the onset of mania or the psychological concomitants of blood or hormonal diseases. They will trump psychology. So we're always, I was trying as a doctor to sit beside my patient and look outward, partly, I'll say more about this later, but partly because doing that very intently is extremely powerful, that patients feel very deeply understood and sort of freed up by the doctor's consistency. But it is never true. It's like Albie Sachs is saying, well, judgments in cases are never true. It is true that throughout the whole treatment, you are always oscillating to these outer views of external norms and social requirements. Threats of harm to the patient can cause similar shifts from attunement to judgment. Intersubjective therapy is a newer, yet more constrained variant of self-psychology grounded in what I call relentless empathy, but its literature contains examples of these sorts of collapses. I'm thinking of the case of a patient called Jane, who becomes delusional in a way that makes her want to return to the care of a previous exploitative therapist, whom she now sees as the Christ. The intersubjective therapist interrupts Jane's religious ruminations. He says that there will be no meeting with the exploitative counselor. The analyst announces that he has his own plan under which Jane will become well again and return to live with the people who love her. Whatever our view of that intervention, we are likely to find the therapist's apprehension that it will be disastrous for a vulnerable patient to return to an exploitative therapist to constitute good judgment. If in extreme cases it pays to exercise judgment, why not in routine ones? Often I work with patients who had repeated bad and even injurious experiences in romantic relationships, especially after I wrote Should You Leave? People came to me with that sort of trouble. It might be that they chose poorly, or it might be that they chose reasonably and then behaved in ways that brought out the worst in a partner. For the therapist, however mistrustful of judgment, the tasks are likely to be different, helping a patient navigate a relationship or helping a patient manage to leave one. Existential attunement, seeing the partner as the patient does, may inform the inquiry, but the therapist's sense of what's up will color the treatment. Substantive judgment influences procedural judgment. I don't want to frame my intervention in a way that will nudge my patient toward what I consider the source of the trouble. Leston Havens writes of forms of influence or control that he calls mental trespass and psychological possession. These are, sort of more subtle forms of abuse in relationships where one member dominates. The therapist may believe, even in the absence of frank abuse, that it's best for the patient to walk away, but then how far are we from Freud and Frink? I live and work in Providence, Rhode Island. It's a college town with 7 substantial campuses. The problems of students became very familiar to me. It was hard not to be aware of typical social patterns. A young man is in a relationship with a young woman whom he finds attractive but disappointing, not his intellectual equal. His contempt erodes the relationship. She leaves, and the loss throws him into depression. In the depressive episode and after it, he sees the young woman differently. She was an angel, just the right match for him. She had only this single flaw, oversensitivity to his mild observations. When this pattern repeats itself, it's tempting to bypass attunement and reference the prior train wreck. This criticism of the new girlfriend, that she has no ear for avant-garde theater, isn't it identical to what you said in the last relationship? I would prefer to have my patient avoid a depressive episode, or at least to recognize the pattern, denigration followed by idealization, before it plays out. There will be a cost. Questioning my patient's perception puts me in a different relationship to him. It may be hard to regain the magic that comes with attunement, but repetition is a challenge that attunement handles poorly. Critics, the Sullivanian therapist Philip Bromberg is one, say that relying on attunement is like being purposely deaf in one ear. I found messages from that other ear, the pragmatic one, insistent. My method in therapy consisted of trying to restrict myself to the existential posture and failing, continually relying on my awareness of social nuance. The mixing of therapies has given rise to a literature on efficacy, whether schools of therapy outperform eclecticism, and whether within therapies, adherence to the strictures matters. To my reading, there are no reliable answers. Toward the end of my time with patients, I wondered whether my attunement to social nuance had diminished. For example, I'd begun seeing more gay, bi, and sexually fluid or ambiguous young patients. Occasionally, one would complain that I was incapable of understanding the social challenges that they faced. I had ties to gay psychiatry. I served on professional committees with leaders in the movement. We referred patients back and forth. I subscribed to the major LGBTQ+ listserv for providers, going back to when the category was only gay and lesbian. My reading included Maggie Nelson, Garth Greenwell, Edward Louis, Edmund White, and Jean Winterston. From the start of my career, I treated gay and lesbian patients, not as a specialist, but in the course of the work. And as for the rest, romance and its mishaps were my bread and butter. So were claims of misunderstanding. For people who were ignored or misheard in childhood, swans raised by ducks, being misunderstood is something like a default complaint. The posture is the topic of psychotherapy. When I was in training, the received wisdom promulgated largely by European Jewish immigrants was that seasoned, well-analyzed therapists could take on all comers, young and old, black and white, immigrant and native-born, rich and poor, religious and unobservant, educated and uneducated, gay and straight, male and female, nor would today's longer list of identities have fazed my instructors. This stance minimizes the role of the need to assess norms and likelihoods. As I aged, arguably, the assumption should have held all the more. Seeing my graying hair and wrinkled skin, no one expected me to have an automatic understanding of contemporary mores. Signing on, patients gave consent that was highly informed. Patients educated me. You need to know what a Korean single mother demands of her children. Depicting family culture is part of every therapy. But I, like everyone, became increasingly aware that psychiatry had served disfavored populations poorly. I worried that my young non-binary patients might be right. Imagine a patient. They complained that the end of a relationship was unexpected and heartless, a betrayal. I wonder about the segment of the queer community that they've entered. Does it promise danger, excitement, and transgression, or instead a level of authenticity, honesty, and security that boy-girl dating often lacks? That was often what patients claimed. Deserting my patient, was the lover only doing the expected, or was my patient really blindsided? I was less in touch than I had once been. My sources weren't current. At a younger age, I might have beefed up my knowledge, or I would simply have known. Loss of nimbleness or facility is a common reason for retirement from medical practice, but catechizing myself, I wondered whether a contrasting explanation was not equally important. I felt ever more confident in my judgment. I'd written Should You Leave a quarter century before. Since then, I'd seen many more relationships play out. About my non-binary patient, I might think, embracing gender fluidity, you enjoy the social fluidity that comes with it, but you need to learn how to deal with it. You're discovering what you can tolerate, and you're disappointed. The complaint is largely against yourself. Perhaps what I was experiencing was brittleness or annoyance that can come with age. I could see all the way to the end of the relationship. Why was my patient so slow? I disliked this posture. I grew up with close relatives who were perceptive and incisive and who could use their social awareness in cruel ways. They gave me a distaste for certain sorts of insight. I did not want to rely on them. I didn't want to impose on patients or rob them of agency. I had not entered psychotherapy to become an advisor. I worried about the balance in my use of attunement and judgment. In later years, I found the application of judgment harder to resist, a shift that made psychotherapy less interesting, and in particular less interesting in comparison to writing. Psychiatry has a narrow definition of ambivalence. It is not mild mixed feelings, but painful uncertainty or even paralysis brought on by powerful opposing impulses. I hope that I've depicted my ambivalence about judgment, even considered judgment. It can be distracting, intrusive, constraining, and diminishing, and I found it indispensable. As a doctor-writer, I found my two callings similar. I spent my days asking where we are, what needs saying, and what effect will arise from saying it in a given way. And I fell short. I loved complex literary creations, but found myself telling artless tales. In every hour and every sentence, I failed my ideals because my aesthetic and my character were at odds. Readers and patients received an awkward amalgam. I have always felt the appeal of the Henry James story, The Middle Years. What the dying author Dencombe says about the writer's career applies to a life's work in therapy as well. There is no second chance, no ideal result, no pearl. You know the famous lines. The pearl is the unwritten. We work in the dark, we do what we can, we give what we have. What I had was a mistrust of pragmatism, a talent for it, and a tendency to rely on it. I suspect that many readers of the James story overlook or dismiss the viewpoint of Dencombe's physician, Dr. Yu. He suggests the second chance has been the public's, the chance to find the point of view, to pick up the pearl. There's comfort in that thought, that our readers and patients manage to see worth in our imperfect offerings and to improve on them. So, there we are.
The floor is open for questions. I think Rainey, then, yeah, Rainey Desta.
Yes, thank you. Your candor and self-insight were very moving. My question is really about a platitude about judgment that I've always believed in its relationship to wisdom, which is one reason why judgment improves with experience is that we have a wider range of cases upon which to draw analogies with. And I would have thought that that applied in the case of psychotherapy. But what you say leads me to ask this question, which is, can it be that that kind of cumulative wisdom which comes with experience that hones judgment depends on social circumstances remaining relatively stable? I was really struck by what you said about the fact that the changing nature, especially since you are in a college town and you're dealing with, as it were, the avant-garde of social change in the student population, that the kinds of judgments that might have been confidently transferred to new cases in the past don't apply under new conditions. I mean, it would be a very interesting thing if judgment had certain historical preconditions in order to be trustworthy.
Yes, so I entirely agree with the question. I think that what older doctors bring to psychotherapy is an enormous load of experience, just having seen a lot, having seen how things work out. And I think what they don't bring is, a finger on the pulse of the culture, so that if it's changing in dramatic ways, it's sort of hard to tell what is a standard complaint and what is actually an insightful reference to a change in norms. So there are really two problems: the extent to which we should apply our knowledge of norms, and the extent to which our knowledge of norms is trustworthy. I spent some time early in my career on a committee that dealt with impaired physicians or patients had made complaints about. And some of the problems were sort of staying current, not with medical realities, but with cultural realities, I found. I had a doctor client who was not a patient, who said to me, this is many years ago, "Do I have to see Star Wars?" Lots of his patients were making reference to Star Wars, and he had no idea what they were talking about. And I thought...
Glenn.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Peter. is indeed a talk for which I can only use the word that Rainey used. It was very moving. I would like to ask you whether you think that there is something about psychoanalysis, psychiatry, as a profession, which means that anybody who looks back upon his whole career with the honesty that you have been doing in this talk will inevitably show it to be a history of failure, because it won't have been possible to apply the rules and principles that one thinks one should have done in a helpful and consistent way to one's patients, so that inevitably
Yes.
it will be a failure.
I think that's right. So I think doctors have a different out, which is results, right? You want your patients to get better. And of course, one can fool oneself in this regard, but partly because patients are self-selecting. You know, they come if they think you're going to be the right doctor for them, or they leave if you're not. You know, people tend to have very good results, much better results than are in the data. Patients just do well, partly they're resilient, and partly we, you know, one way or another, we figure out how to do well with them. So I'm not sort of bemoaning the failure of my practice as a medical enterprise. But I did feel, and also, of course, something that people do that I didn't do is they sort of make up their own therapy. You know what I mean? We talked over meals, some people about charisma and how people found psychotherapies. And I think even privately within any town, doctors think, oh, they're sort of doing their own therapy. I chose this particular stance, which was to try to do a very liberating, very understanding kind of psychotherapy where I was very close to patients and expected more and more to emerge from them. And as I say, I failed at it because I'm not that kind of person. You know what I mean? Rachel's here, my wife, and she would say that I have a sort of an uncanny ability to size up social situations. So she would say, oh, that couple's doing so well together. And I'd say, I'm not sure, you know. And 2 months later, they'd be divorced or, you know, whatever it was, or 2 years later. And this is a career-long concern for me. As a writer, one of my early breaks was writing a column for psychiatrists. So I wrote a column every month for 10 plus years that went to other doctors. And I was very free. I was allowed to do sort of what I wanted. It was the most read column in psychiatry. So the publisher and editor had really left me to my own devices. And the first thing I wrote about was sort of let this cup pass for me. It was about how we, you know, you'll have a patient who comes in who believes that if they work with you, their cancer will remit. And their cancer actually does do a little better in the course of treatment. And you think, no, you know, I don't have that power. I don't want to have that kind of power. We're just, you know, getting to know one another. And that was what the first essay I wrote, really, in the course of a 10-year career of writing for other doctors was about.
So, yeah, go on.
Just to follow up, your answer was about yourself as a person. My question was about psychoanalysis and psychiatry as a profession. I don't think that a dentist, looking back upon his career, would necessarily talk about it as a history of failure.
Right.
I think that's true of other medical specialties. I was wondering whether it's something about the specialty of psychiatry and psychoanalysis in particular that lends itself to this kind of reflection as failure.
Well, I feel like I could answer that a dozen ways. So let me answer in a negative way, which was one reason I didn't become a psychoanalyst was that psychoanalysts were so full of themselves. From the point of view of the student, they really didn't want to give straightforward treatment. They had a guru-like quality, the reason I quoted Adam Phillips. And I think I became a sort of run-of-the-mill psychotherapist because of the extreme hierarchical nature of psychoanalysis at the time, which was very different than the medical ethos of, see one, do one, teach one, where you kind of saw how someone sewed up after an appendectomy, and then you did it yourself, and then you taught the next person. But to give two other answers, one is, I think, yes, in terms of character, people who go into psychotherapy often are contemplative, self-critical, and I think there is something else about psychiatry which is it's humbling. It's humbling. Despite what I said about success, mental illnesses are pretty relentless. They're recurrent. You can think you've done well. You dismiss a patient. They come back in a few years in terrible shape. You're dealing with, and it's not just the illnesses, it's the circumstances, right? Bad things happen to people. Two bad things happen, you treat them, and then two more bad things happen. And you think it's just the people you didn't want those bad things to happen to. And then there are, someone asked me over a meal, do you like your patients? You like all your patients. I mean, as a psychiatrist, really, I don't think I ever had an unlikable patient, and I certainly, and I had patients who've done terrible things in life, but in the room with you where they're trying to get better, you have some sympathy with them. And I would always teach students there are no bad patients. Students in the old days when we started out teaching really with psychotic inpatients, they would complain that they were doing psychotherapy with people who could, not plausibly respond to it. But there was, I felt there was some value even in that exercise. Now, did I turn to medication? I've written a lot about medication. That's what people expect me to speak about is medication, and that makes the whole enterprise easier because you're getting patients into a state where they can use psychotherapy, or they just get better on the medication without any further intervention on your part. So I don't know if I've answered your question. I guess it's still somewhat personal, but yeah.
Susan.
Peter, wow. Thank you for such a rich talk. I'll try to confine my question to one two-part question. Although, as an aside, I have known at least two psychoanalysts who were not full of themselves. So, there's always the exception. Look, you said you didn't enter psychotherapy to become an advisor, okay? So I guess one part of the question is, what did you enter psychotherapy to become? And the second part of the question, well, it was now just stimulated by your remark about always liking your patients. I remembered when I started teaching philosophy that suddenly all kinds of students who I would have loathed if they'd been my classmates suddenly, had these sides that I could find something to be sympathetic to. But I'm also asking under the impression of having recently read one of your works of fiction, Death of a Great Man, which for those of you who probably haven't read it, is told in the first person by an aging psychotherapist who happens to live in Providence, Rhode Island, and
takes on a patient who is a barely disguised version of Donald Trump. I'm not giving anything away if you want to read the novel, because it says that at the beginning. That is clear at the beginning. And it goes through this enormous, the kind of self-reflection that you just did is also taking place throughout the novel, and the psychotherapist's relation to this patient who not only does he find noxious in certain ways, but realizes has done immense damage to the country as a whole. I mean, it's actually written, although I think you published in 2020, it's written in the second administration of the real Donald Trump, as he calls himself. So if you were such a psychotherapist with such a patient, would you have given him advice, and how?
All right. These are wonderful questions, and let me start with the second and go back to the first. So this book, Death of the Great Man, you know, I'm trying not to write doctor's fiction. I'm trying to write fiction writer's fiction, literary fiction. You know, after I'd written it, I thought, no, this is a doctor writer's book, because it really is a sort of a love story about the profession. And to give something away in the book, at one point, this patient, the great man, throws the therapist into jail, basically, into like solitary confinement, because he's kind of had it with him. And this, you know, sweet doctor in the jail cell thinks, well, this is really part of the therapy, you know. How I behave will get back to the patient, and I really should spend the time thinking about, you know, sort of what I've done wrong, what my, you know, where the therapy got us to this place, and letting other cases flow. This is an answer to the experience, letting other cases flow up into consciousness. So in this jail cell, the therapist is telling himself stories that he thinks will be useful in this ongoing treatment. He is absolutely undeterred by anything a patient can do. And I think that is my ideal. I mean, the role of a doctor is to be dedicated, and it's not to be narcissistic and not to pat yourself on the back. It is to figure out, you know, what you're supposed to be figuring out, to give the patient space to figure things out as well. So why I went into psychiatry, you know, I think I always wanted to be a writer. I know I always wanted to be a writer. And I was at Harvard in history and literature, got a scholarship in basically modern literature and philosophy at University College London, was studying with Frank Kermode, and the Vietnam War was going on, and I thought I have to do something relevant. I was in psychoanalysis as a patient, and I thought, well, psychoanalysis is a lot like literary criticism. I'll go into psychiatry, and I'll become I'll do it as a literary discipline. I had no idea. Honestly, I did not know that measles was an infectious disease, or that what the liver did or where it was in the body. I mean, I went into medical school as an entire naive. But of course, medical school is very compelling, and I ended up in this other position of actually wanting to be helpful and wanting to know a lot, and having that encompass the more biological side of psychiatry. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but I think I was sort of admiring of the professions, and I think in my writing, if it's been criticized, it's that I really believe in psychiatry. I'm not skeptical enough about psychiatry. I'm presenting what psychiatrists believe in and why they believe it, and it is if you look at listening to Prozac, like in its own way, looking more at biological psychiatry, it is admiring of how we got to where we were at that point, in 1993 with antidepressants, and the way that the Trump on the Couch novel is an attempt to honor the profession.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was so interesting. The tension between sort of having empathy versus exercising judgment and then perhaps becoming an advisor, that seems fascinating to me. But the question that came to mind is that insofar as it's empathy, you're there on the other side trying to feel and repeat back some of the things that the patient said, make them feel heard. Can ChatGPT do that? What's missing there?
Maybe we're going to get some answers tomorrow about ChatGPT. I tried at the beginning of this talk, and maybe this is the reason I did this, to say how active psychotherapy is in the mind of the therapist. And that was long, I think, maybe too long for people.
No, it was
but
great.
but I kept cutting it down because we did exercises like just sitting across from one another and asking questions and trying to get a sense of what was going on in the mind of the other. And we got advice like, no, your metaphors, that person grew up on a farm and you're using urban metaphors. Your metaphors should be rural. Every bit about what you say and how you say it and the pace at which you say it and the perspective from which you're saying it needs to be thought through. And I think of it as a lot like skiing, another thing I do badly, which is, you want your lower body to be doing all kinds of things in response to everything on the mountain, and your upper body is still. And so you're facing the patient sort of still, and you're saying things in a conversational tone, not trying to make it too special or artificial, responding as if in a conversation. But what's going on is immensely tailored. You're really thinking about what should I do in this moment. And that was part of what I loved about it. It was extreme, why it's hard to hate patients. It's extremely engaging because whatever's going wrong, you're trying to correct it. And it would astonish me if ChatGPT could do this at this stage. I mean, the future, who knows? But, I was saying this to someone earlier today. If you go back to the 70s, maybe 60s or 70s, there was a primitive psychotherapy machine that only said about 15 things, and patients would interact with it, and they would like it. They liked, they liked this machine that said 15 things to them. And this goes to another topic. I left sort of just before COVID, so I didn't do a lot of Zoom psychotherapy. And I hated Zoom psychotherapy. I had patients who would go off to Europe or whatever, and we had some HIPAA compliant, thing that allowed you to speak with them. And instead of having 45 minutes or 50-minute sessions, I'd say, let's speak for 15 minutes. I was very reliant on the, sort of intimate sitting across from the patient, sitting with the patient. I didn't do well. Now, maybe if I worked during COVID, I would have done well with it. But patients love Zoom sessions. They don't have to, drive somewhere. They don't have to take time off from work. They go into, they love Zoom sessions. So I don't know the answer. Maybe the stuff I relied on and cared about is entirely passé. I think it's possible. But I'm trying to give a sense of what this was like in this particular career. And the next iteration will be different.
Kostik.
Yeah, I graduated as a psychologist and practiced psychotherapy for 7 years. And a occasionally I would run into patients who would demand that I express my judgment about their plans, explaining not unreasonably that how on earth I'm supposed to talk to you if you refuse to tell me what you think, and I'm not stupid enough to think that you think nothing. And my colleagues with whom I'd consult were roughly divided into those who said that that's a not unreasonable demand, and since we want our patients in general to act rationally, we should respond to that. And others would obviously say that this is an example of resistance that needs to be addressed as resistant and not as a rational demand. In this divide, which side would you rather be on?
Yeah. So, I don't want to appear naive about this question. My book, Should You Leave, if I'm right, the first sentence is, all you want is a simple piece of advice. That's the first sentence of the book. And Should You Leave is really about this nature of advice emerging in therapies that are not directed toward advice. I mean, it's also about intimacy and mid-century theories of intimacy. It's a very complicated book. So when I wrote Listening to Prozac, I had chosen a particular editor because she did fiction. And it was Nan Graham, then at Viking Penguin. She later became editor-in-chief at Scribner. And she said if I gave her Listening to Prozac, which based on the pitch, there was some competition between different houses to get it, that she would work on a novel with me. And she had very distinguished clients. I said, fine. So when Listening to Prozac did well, she said, no, and so did my agent, you have to write another nonfiction book. So I wrote Should You Leave, which is told in the literary second person. The main character in Should You Leave is you. And you want a piece of advice. And there are all these different yous. And one of the reasons I did you was because I felt my patients in Listening to Prozac had been overly exposed. I mean, literally, Oprah's producers called me up and said, we want Tess. Tess was one of the vignette characters in Listening to Prozac. And I thought it was too much exposure. And with you, with the characters in the case vignettes being you, there's no deal with the reader that it is any actual particular patient. You can do more sort of amalgams. So anyway, so I was very aware of this issue of advice. And that was sort of my compromise of a half fictional, half non-fictional book. It had, however, the wrong title. It should have been called Listening to Intimacy as a good follow-up to Listening to Prozac. People said that they couldn't put it, Should You Leave at their bedside because their spouse would worry about it. Anyway, but it was the right title for the book because it was about you. It was about you, and I think it was also about, sort of what psychotherapy is. It was about this relationship with you. Anyway, but yes, I think we're often wrong. I think one reason we don't give advice a lot is despite my sense of saying I know how relationships go, we're often wrong. In my first book, Moments of Engagement, I talked about something, and I'm not sure I'm going to get this right, but a patient said she had always wanted to learn to fly and a plane. And I said, well, why don't you? And she did. And then the next thing, she said she'd always wanted to do something else. And I said, well, why don't you? And she said, you're just like my parents, always pushing me to do things that are, and I thought, that's right. It's not sort of a universal answer. You really have to know a great deal about a person to give a nudge in a certain direction.
Peter.
I was interested in the relationship between writing and therapy, and it reminded me of Jenny's talk, talking about dance and then writing or talking about it. And in particular, I wonder whether let me speak in the first person. For me, writing is different from other activities because you can do it over and over again. You can revise, and I actually like revising. You know, a first version, a second version, a 20th version. But most of life and most performance isn't like that, right? You can recover from a mistake in a performance or in a therapy session. Maybe you figure out a better way of handling the next session. But it's not the same as in the quiet of your room fixing a sentence or a paragraph or a chapter to work better. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you see, I mean, I know you've made comments, you stopped doing the therapy, turned more full-time writing, but for a while you were doing both. Whether that reparative or the ability to get things is, it seems to me such a privilege, unlike most of life, to be able to get things as, not perfect, but as good as you can get them. You can write until the changes are kind of better, worse, neutral. They're getting a little better here, and then at that point you stop.
So Susan will tell you also she's reading a sort of unpublished manuscript of mine, which is about the nature of retirement for creative people. And when I stopped seeing patients, and especially during COVID, where people were around me were working by remote, I'd stopped seeing patients, I was writing, and people started treating me as retired. And I thought, why are you treating me as retired? I've been a doctor writer for 40 years. I'm still a doctor writer, or whatever you call it. I mean, I have 8 books in print or something at that point. Why am I retired just because I'm not seeing patients? But I think they had a sense that they could interrupt me at any time during the day, which is not necessarily a good thing for a writer either. But they certainly couldn't do it when I was, in session with patients. And but exactly what you said, I think, is what I say in one part of that manuscript, which is that writing and patient care seemed very similar to me. They both had these problems of expression and eliciting things. I mean, I haven't taught much about writing, but when I teach writing, what I find is that, beginning writers don't care much about the reader. They have things they want to express, but they're not very focused on what it will elicit from the reader. And you really do have readers, imagined readers, when you're writing, and you have patients in front of you. But I think anyway, the big difference is, yes, you can revise at leisure. You can say to yourself, I'm writing this, the Freudian metaphor that my analysts probably used way back then was sort of shit, playing with shit. You know what I mean? That you can kind of push something out and play with it instead of holding it in, and then you can gradually improve it. And that's how I write. I write through revision. But I think it also does happen in psychotherapy, right? That you do something, you've made a mistake, it puts the patient off course, you come to the issue again, you get a little better the next time, the patient gets it a little better. So there is some recursion in psychotherapy as well. The recursion issue, by the way, was very much the basis for listening to Prozac, which was that patients would go on this medicine, they would get better from, say, whatever they were being treated for, depression or obsessionality or something, but they'd say, I'm also, more assertive at work, I'm a better parent, I'm less anxious in my dating relationships. And they would come back some months later and say, I'm not depressed again, but I want to be back on the medicine for those other social effects. And you'd have to say, that was sort of the basis for that book, is what are the ethics of this and what have we gotten ourselves into?
Jenny.
Okay, so what I have is not really quite it's a little bit not clear in a way, and I was wondering, it seemed to me that at some points in your talk, I was feeling, oh, he was disappointed with the therapeutic process itself. And I don't know whether that's true or not true, because I also feel that you're very, very, obviously extremely, as you said, engaged in it, and that there was a very strong connection. So I'm wondering whether you were disappointed, and if you were, whether you thought about, there are obviously a wide panoply of different approaches to psychotherapy, and to maybe not as many to psychoanalysis, but certainly some. Did you ever consider moving away from the training that you had towards a different model? And did you ever think of, partly in the way it comes to my mind, a sort of more pastoral, the way you talk sounds almost pastoral sometimes, that you're seeing judgment as, what do I do now? What do I do? Whereas I'm wondering whether judgment could also be, not like the particulars of a daily thing, but here revealing the person to themselves in terms of the big questions of, anger, fear, vengeance, those kind of primary color emotions that often are underneath whatever the decision is. So I'm not quite sure what I'm asking, but there it is.
Yes. So again, maybe I should start with the end of it, which is what, I don't want to pretend that I didn't say to patients, you are, you're sounding angry, but there's an undercurrent of sadness here. Shouldn't we be thinking about the sadness? It's not that I didn't want to exercise that sort of judgment, because that exactly is empathic, or picking up the vibes, whatever it is, attunement. So yes, I mean that seems to me an essential part of therapy. Or maybe you're not even picking up the vibe, but you're aware it's there, and why isn't the vibe? It could be the absence of something. So should you leave is actually about, when I came to this profession, it just seemed right to me. I loved it. And so I collected psychotherapies. So should you leave is about 7 or 8 kinds of therapy, some of them strange, that I learned or went to some conference about and picked up a little bit of, or where I interviewed the founder of the therapy, or whatever it was. So I was really a collector of therapies. And part of this thing that's going on in your mind is you're thinking, well, we could use that other technique. We could just, and sometimes I did. So there's Murray Bowen had a psychotherapy that was based on his own experience. And this is a side track thing, but it's sort of interesting. He was someone who worked with schizophrenic patients, inpatients at NIH, but he had problems in his own family. He came from a Southern family that was very prominent in town. They'd been the undertakers, which has led to a furniture business and so on. And he always felt that he was not free, that when he came home, he was sort of constrained, and he was the younger son, and he was disobeying the mother or whatever he was doing. And he decided he would free himself of that. So he established, he created an elaborate ruse where he sent different letters to different members of the family so they'd be angry at each other, and there'd be lots of trouble when he came home. And he came home and let all this turmoil occur around him. And then he felt like free for a few minutes. Like instead of feeling like a young child, after 2 minutes, he got 10 minutes of, of good space. And he turned this into a psychotherapy, did this with some patients, like psychotherapy in your own family. He would send them home with tasks to do in their own family. And he came to a meeting like this, but it was a meeting very early in the history of family therapy. And he was supposed to speak on one topic, and he starts out in that direction. All of a sudden, he turns in this other direction, and at what was meant to be a scientific meeting, and tells these stories about his own family. So I did do some of that work with patients, where I thought, like, let's, things aren't that bad, but you have to stop allying with your mother and artificially ally with your father for a while, so your mother will not expect X. We would just do it. So yeah, I'm giving you a sort of a narrow view of a large career, but Should You Leave was one of these complicated books. I was getting a lot off my chest.
Kirsten.
So I'm very interested in the phrase doctor writer. And the space that medicine and literature hold, and a lot of the conversations, Uli's talk and the talk last night by Justice Sachs. And what you were saying about this sort of, the slide, I imagine like a bass and a treble of attunement and judgment, right? Where you have to adjust those. And the image that you have of being across from a patient versus being beside the patient. And that doctor-patient relationship fundamentally being an individual, an interaction between two people, and literature being a writer and a multitude, a kind of unknown multitude. And do you think of writing as a kind of mass therapy? And if you do, how does that change the dials of attunement and judgment as a writer, as somebody writing about mental health and writing about the human condition in your fiction? How does that affect the way that you empathize versus advise?
So, so this is a very good question. And I think what I've said about what's going on in the doctor's mind demonstrates how, at a certain level, psychotherapy, even though you're really with a person, is a very solitary undertaking. You're all alone with yourself in the room trying to figure out what the next step is. And I felt that I'm kind of a curmudgeon, that I like the solitude of writing, and I like the solitude of psychotherapy, and you kind of get a certain sort of intimacy without having to deal with all the problems of intimacy in a less structured environment. But I think it's also true that in writing, I really was addressing someone. I didn't want to be autistic as a writer. I was trying to address some reasonable reader, and what level of knowledge and intelligence can you assume? Are you assuming too much? And then, of course, you have these wonderful relationships with editors who say, serotonin, you can't use that word in the first 5 chapters. I mean, you've got because when I was writing that, no one had heard of serotonin, and so you're exactly gauging a certain sort of reader. So when Listening to Prozac came out, I did a lot of bookstores. It was a different era. You got flown all around and whatever, and people came up to me and said, "I'm so grateful. This book was so helpful to my aunt, and she's better now." And the book was not a book that was especially meant to be useful. It was about a certain observation I had that on these medicines, people had these personality changes, and what did it mean that medicine's meant to treat illness or really tweaking personality and so on. And so I said, I didn't really mean to be helpful. And that was clearly the wrong thing. You can only say that about once. And I realized that you have no control over what the book becomes. And, William Styron had written Darkness Visible, all this about, it had been an op-ed in the New York Times, and he did a book about it, and it was about what depression was. It was a particular kind of depression in an alcoholic older man, but it gave, some permission to speak about depression. And then Listening to Prozac kind of fit into that slot. It was seen as a way of explaining the biology of depression, a new viewpoint of depression, and giving people permission to talk about depression. And I realized that I just had to take the book it was this international bestseller. I just had to take it for what it was. It wasn't, that because I'd written it for a certain kind of reader and meant for it to have a certain intellectual level, had nothing to do with what it was doing as a functional object out in the world. So, that's I did sort of learn that lesson, but in a way I didn't learn it. I kept on writing sort of the same way at this sort of the same level, which, editors say, well, that's sort of a Harper's Atlantic, back when there was Harper's, Harper's Atlantic level of whatever, science, medical writing. But I have to say, I always considered myself a writer. I was a writer before I was a doctor. I was a writer from age 6 or 8, and as I was writing, listening to Prozac, I actually had just about finished Moments of Engagement. Rachel gave me as a 40th birthday present the air miles and the babysitting necessary to send me to the Iowa Writers Workshop, what was then the summer workshop, for a week, where I was with W.P. Kinsella. And I was, I was sort of working on listening to Prozac. I was sort of working on how you characterize patients and make that lively for people. And I worried later that book's level of convincingness and its role in the culture really came more from the writing than the science. Like, the science could be right or wrong, but if you get the patient vignettes right, it's going to be, seem sort of plausible. And so Abraham Verghese was in that class with me. We were in the Cedar Rapids airport, and portable computers in those days were these enormous cubes. You were carrying your Macintosh sort of below you, and I saw another guy carrying a Macintosh, and I said, we could share a cab, And that was Abraham Verghese, and he was in the same little class with W.P. Kinsella. This is Bill Kinsella. This is the guy who wrote the book Shoeless Joe that became the movie Field of Dreams. And he, by the way, he was a Canadian writer. He had written more books on a certain subject that would now be politically incorrect. He had written more short stories than anyone. In the history, in sort of recorded history, he had more short stories on a single topic.
Wait, now please tell us.
It was about Native Canadians, about Indians on a reserve. There were comic tales about Indians on a reservation in Canada. And that was really what made him a popular writer in Canada before Shoeless Joe. He started writing about baseball. Anyway, so that was my class, and he was terrific. I mean, he really introduced me to that second-person fiction that became Should You Leave and some other things. So it was a good week.
So I was going to try and make sure that Kirsten wasn't the last question, but on the other hand, since we are past 7 o'clock, I'll reserve my question for later. And can we thank Peter for wonderful.